Welcome, Angela, Reverend Angela Church, I should say. Thank you so much for being part of our show on Tuesday for the Edinburgh Interfaith Association Interfaith Insights show. Quite a mouthful, isn't it?
A mouthful and a half, yes. Yeah.
So I really enjoyed interviewing earlier on today, and it was more of a conversation. I think that's what's important, because interview makes it sound so cold and
it does, yeah.
distant. So it's good to have that conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Nasim.
No, thank you for being part of the show, and I love the kind of themes that we kind of tackle, and the guests that we have, the very inspiring guests, and equally inspiring musicians that come along. I always say come along, but do you know what I mean? It is kind of coming along from my living room to your living room, that kind of idea.
Sure, right.
So to kind of continue the conversation we were having on your work in the ministry and how you started, you shared some wonderful stories. Well, I wanted, because the show we talked about faith and philanthropy, and what there's so many parts of your work that you do that really kind of interest me. The one thing that I wanted to kind of touch on was the effect that you had on the youngsters when you were working as a youth minister, because you mentioned that you were working with kids from very wealthy backgrounds just outside DC, and they perhaps have lived a very kind of sheltered life in that they kind of lived in their bubble, and you kind of popped their bubble. How was that for you?
Oh, well, that was it was different going to a church with the funds to be able to do just about anything that they wanted to do. I had done previous youth ministry in Kentucky, and the churches were middle class, lower class. So to go to an area where money was not really an object to do anything, to raise money for our trip to Fairbanks, Alaska, we did a 5K run, and we had a woman who was a tennis pro who set everything up and put it all together. So, I mean, that was out of my wheelhouse. And so just to fit in, I just said, I'm me. This is who I am. I don't know anything about having a lot of money, but I do know what makes a good person, I think, and what to try to bring to the kids that would give them some kind of anchor, and also some kind of information on how to live their lives and how to form who they were becoming.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fantastic, the impact that you've had on them. And can you think of one or two cases perhaps where you found that you really struggled, or you felt that, you started at A and then when you got to Z, what a massive difference that you had made in their lives, or how they had changed as a person?
Well, I think of one story as we were in Alaska. I tried to talk to the kids about the fact that we take a back seat to others at a point when we're trying to be present to them, because it's about the person who's in front of us. And so we would have our meals. We stayed in a little church. We kind of camped out in their church, in their basement, and then when it was time for services, we had to clean everything up and get ready. But we had our meals there. And so each group I assigned different groups each time to serve the meals to one another, because that's part of who we are. We are servants. We should be servants to one another. And so that particular night, we were having chocolate pudding and vanilla pudding and butterscotch pudding. And so one of the young women who was being one of the servers, she really wanted a chocolate pudding. And the rule was, you get what's left over. Mm. You get after everyone has chosen, you get to choose. And she really wanted that chocolate pudding. And I saw her, and she grabbed the chocolate pudding before anybody got to eat and put it in her pocket.
Oh.
And so she was going to take care of herself first. And so I went to her and I said, you really need to put that chocolate pudding back. And she said, how do you know I have a chocolate pudding? And I said, because I saw you take it. Mm. And the point is that we let everyone else serve first, and then we serve. She got very upset that she didn't get her way.
Yeah. And that's
that
what
she
these kids
couldn't.
were kind of used to. They were used to having their own way, and
Right.
you know, attending these kind of camps and after school clubs or whatever you want to call them
Hmm.
can be very humbling. And you can see that you know, there is a change, that you obviously inspire that change, and that does have an impact on kids, because they're away from the normal environment where it's just a case of
Yeah.
me, and then so all of a sudden you're having to think about others and how to kind of be there for them.
Yeah, trying to get them to transition,
Yeah.
to go from this is how I think to open up even more, to say this is a possibility, to how I can learn how to think. You know, in reference to other people, get outside yourself. And oh, they did a tremendous job, but that was just one of the little lessons. And I imagine to this day she remembers it. So,
Exactly. So can you think of a particular case study that you now have know as an adult? How has he kind of kept those lessons close to his heart and made a change in a very dramatic way?
well, when I first got back in touch with one of my youth, we did things like when we went and worked with other children and other groups. We did puppets, we did drama, we did music, and then we also did teaching as well. And so one of the young women, after I had gotten back in touch with her through Facebook, sent me a message, and she said she's a first grade teacher, and she said, I just want you to know that I think I'm a teacher because of you.
Oh.
And so she was passing on, and now she's having to do everything from the computer and teaching from the computer, teaching the classes because of the pandemic. And I see her with her own children, setting things up, making it possible for them to learn and doing creative things. So that's one of the stories I think that very touched me deeply.
Yeah, bits of gems of information that you've passed on and they've carried with them till today. And then you worked in a totally different setting, which was the prison system. So
Mm.
and I'm sure there's many kind of stories for you to. One of the questions one of the things I'm interested in is to find out how you were seen by the inmates and how you were treated perhaps by are they called correctional officers or
Correctional
guards
officers.
or security? How were you kind of perceived? Because you were there in the middle, I would imagine.
Yeah, you're really, as a chaplain, you are put in a situation where you walk a very fine line. Either you're seen as a cop by the inmates,
Mm-hmm.
you could be, or you're seen as an inmate lover by the staff.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that fine line that we walk that says, I'm here for you as a person. And I think getting beyond role designations, going to the person themselves. I'm here for you as a person, and this is what I do. I think of one of the correctional officers whose wife, and they were having a baby, and the baby died in the womb. And I spent all day with the family, just sat with the family and was with them. And then when the baby was born, held the baby and spent time with the officer. And then when I went to the funeral, one of the relatives said, "Oh yeah, I know you. You're the woman who sits." And that spoke volumes to me, that that was what I was supposed to do,
That you were there
and
for.
that's who I was supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then to another end, a woman who had just come into the prison as an inmate, and her husband died right away after she came in.
Oh.
And so she wanted to go to the funeral, and she was told that she could not because of her custody level, that she was not allowed.
Mm.
And so I began to go to our associate warden and say, could we do something? Is there anything we could do? And she said, nope, her custody won't allow it. And so I went to her case manager and I said, can I see her file? And they pulled her file and found out they had made a mistake about her custody. And indeed, she would be able to go.
Oh.
And so she was able to actually go to the funeral because I was willing to pursue and say, you're a person, this is important,
Mm-hmm.
this is where you need to be.
And that might have easily, well, it was overlooked until you took those
It was.
steps,
It was, yes.
and and then she was able to attend her husband's funeral. I mean, within with life, we all need faith. But I would have thought, perhaps in the prison system, how is faith actually practiced? I'm talking from a Muslim's point of view. The Ramadan, the prayers, 5 times a day, the Jewish people, the Jewish population, how easily is that accessible within the prison system?
Well, that's why we're there. We're there, as I said, I think I said earlier, I was kind of a guardian. I was a guardian of those faiths. And I had to learn to be a guardian of the faith. And I had to learn, this was such a growing experience for me coming out of one faith and then actually allowing my faith to become a part of everyone else's, and to see how critical and how important and how it made such a difference in their life. So again, to make sure that they had what they needed to practice that faith.
Mm-hmm.
We had a group called a Satru, which can be connected to white supremacy. And they came to me and they said, this was a men's group when I was working in the men's prison. And they came to me and said, we need a sword for our altar. And I said, well, probably not going to happen. You're not going to get a sword. And they said, well, I'm sorry, but this is really critical to who we are. And I said, well, then let's be creative. What can we do? Well, we could make one and chop out of wood. And I said, I'm not even sure that's going to work. So eventually we compromised and came up with the fact that we could do one out of cardboard.
Okay.
And that they could use that. Mm-hmm. Ramadan was always a huge thing. We had a large Muslim population in most of the prisons I was in. And of course, we had a contract imam, and the imam would come in certainly every week for Juma and would come in for different things. And getting what we needed, getting the officers on board, because we did sack lunches for breaking the fast, for having the Eid. We would try to get everything settled and done. And, there are all these regulations that go with security.
Of course.
So having things like that always took extra time. They had to be released from their units where they lived at a certain time before everyone else was released. And so there had to be a complete list of who was part of that celebration, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so that was always changing. Yeah. If they didn't show up to the chapel, where were they?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because security, you had to make sure they weren't going over the razor wire. Mm-hmm. So there was all kinds of little things.
No, I completely understand that security is top priority. But do you feel
right.
that in terms of the needs, whether they're faith or family related, would you say that the warden was accommodating at all? And it depends, I suppose, very much on the warden, his or her own outlook as well.
Probably overall, yes. The wardens were very cooperative. They had an understanding of what had to be done. Probably the best warden I worked with was a woman, and she was always thinking outside the box with me. She was willing to do that. Whereas, we had an ongoing relationship and conversation always about what was happening. And she had compassion. Just a quick story about her was we went from where the women, this was with the women, could wear their own clothes. And all over the Bureau of Prisons, they decided that they couldn't wear their clothes anymore. They had to go to uniforms. And, a woman likes to have her own style. We like to do our own little things with our collars or whatever it may be. And so she called me to her office and she said, do you think we could get about 2,000 scarves donated? Because scarves were big that time. Everybody was tying them different ways and doing different things, and it was a way to be distinctive. And so I said, well, give me an hour. And in about an hour, I had enough scarves. I had 2,000 scarves.
Within an hour?
because of
Wow.
contacts that I had.
Oh.
And I just got on the phone and started calling and saying, look, I need scarves. And so we had a class on how to tie scarves in different ways. And so these uniforms, then the women began to have their own identity
Mm.
because of that. And so that was one of the things that she was so on top of, just to be aware of things like that.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on, Angel, that you worked in a men's prison, and I see obviously a woman's. How did that differ, working in a men's and a women's prison? Was there much difference, or?
Yeah, the way men and women do time is very different. You'll find more drugs with the men. You'll find more weapons, quite creative weapons. You'll find homemade tattoo guns that they make. They don't program. I say program meaning going to different opportunities, even going to religious services as much as the women. The women nest.
Mm.
The women create families. You'll find in the women's prison, somebody is the grandmother, somebody is the mother, somebody's the baby, or my baby girl or my child. And it's amazing. They also have such creativity. I have a bag that they crocheted from garbage bags, from garbage bags that they crocheted. It's a bag that they could take into the shower.
Oh.
So that they could put everything in it, and if it got wet, it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
But they crocheted this beautiful bag with a pattern in it, and they were just very creative and also very concerned about one another.
Mm-hmm.
They were very much into community.
Mm-hmm.
In our women's prison in Lexington, we would have 300 women at the Protestant service on a Sunday morning.
Oh.
We would have 75 to 100 women in Juma on Friday.
Wow.
You know, they wanted to be in touch with their spiritual lives. And their spiritual life then became a part of the community of faith and the community of family that they created.
So
very creative with cooking too, I have to say.
Yeah, they don't want to lose themselves, and they certainly don't want to lose, and the faith is perhaps a doorway to that. You know, they don't want to lose who they are, their identity and their beliefs. And I suppose, you know, we all know that when we talk about our own faith, there's some some scriptures that I find very moving, very inspiring, and there may be something I just passed through reading it, because at that time it doesn't mean anything, or it doesn't have that kind of place in my heart.
Right.
You know, that's with all faiths and all scriptures. So obviously, but it's good that you're, it's fantastic that you were going that extra mile to help these women, and then you said that they were very creative with their tools. What was that about?
Oh yeah, they were very creative with everything. I'm going to go back to that cook. We created a cookbook, a prison cookbook, because we had radiators. I don't know, radiators, and so they cooked a lot on their radiators.
Wow.
And they used irons, and they used all sorts of things. One of the recipes was called peanut butter pig out, and it was made on the radiator. But they were just amazing at what they could take and create something useful. Yeah. Because they didn't have what we have out in the world. They had to figure out how to get what they needed. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say too, in crisis, I believe we find the presence of the Spirit much more prevalent. We are more willing to turn to that at a time in our life, when before we might just say, yes, I believe, but not really pursue. And so in that way, I think that shows how a crisis like being in prison, going to prison, not being able to connect with your family, not having money. That was another thing with the men. The men, they would always ask for money. They would ask their spouses or their girlfriends to send them in money. The women just wanted to talk to their children. And the women, if their husband or their boyfriend was in prison, the women would take up their life and move it to whatever prison that person was in, that man was in. With the women, no. The visiting rooms would be almost empty. It would be very hard for them to get visits, for somebody to bring their child or their family to see them. The men did not stand behind the women like the women stood behind the men.
That's very sad.
It is, yeah, it is.
Just one more question, and I was quite surprised when I'd actually come across this. You told me that you have what's called a couples prison. How does that work out?
It was, well, at one point, somebody flipped a coin in Washington, D.C. and said, hey, let's try this. And so we had the first institution I went to, it was men and women doing time together. Mm-hmm. It kept you very busy because the chapel was a nice place to come to try and find just a quiet spot to just, how can I say, engage.
I understand. So, we don't need to say, this is a family show, Angela. Let's just keep it.
Say no more. Say no more. Well, yeah, but you had what was called a walkie, and a walkie was somebody that you decided you wanted to kind of hang out with, and you could hold hands and walk around the compound, and you spent a lot of time doing goo-goo eyes with one another. But I found that with the men and women, that the men came to church more. So we had a bigger crowd because the women were going to come to church. So we would have at any kind of faith group, we would have huge crowds because the guys were coming with their girlfriends. Mm-hmm. Now, when their wives came or their husbands came to visit in the visiting room, they would say goodbye to their walkie outside, and then they would go through the doors and into the visiting room, and their name was never mentioned. And sometimes they both had a visit at the same time, but they acted like they didn't really know each other.
Interesting. Something that just popped into my head there, Angela. Do people actually you had a couples prison. Can people get married in prison?
They can. It's a long process. Now, they can't get married to each other like in the couple, but they can get married outside. For instance, if they have a fiance and they say, we want to get married, you can do it that way. Okay. Never did a marriage inside. I did a recommitment service, but not any marriages, no. Mm-hmm. Everybody was going to get married. They were in love for sure, and, this is, when I get out, we're going to get married, and I don't think any of that really ever happened. But
well, we could all.
Well, I was going to say too, we saw a high rate of pregnancy as well, and so we had to deal with abortions. We had to deal with where children were going to be going after they were born, and most of the time they went to the grandparents. Or the grandmother was raising the child just as the woman had been raised by her grandmother. So
very sad, very, very sad.
Yeah.
But there's a light at the end of the tunnel for me. That's us done the questions with. But for me, what I'm seeing here is a light at the end of the tunnel, with people like yourself, Angela, sort of leading and helping and going that extra mile, just to try and make their time. I know you're retired now, but look, the stories that you have obviously mean a lot to you. I can only just imagine how much of an impact it must have had on the people in the prison. And I think you've made their time somewhat easier, giving them a smile. We talked about charity earlier on, that is the most charitable act. I think the fact that you've kind of given them a shoulder to lean on and an ear to listen, and to try and accommodate their props they needed. For example, you mentioned the sword needed for the altar, and I think that is something that folk carry for a long, long time. And it's an absolute honor talking to you today, Angela. You certainly inspired me, and I hope that everybody that listens will inspire them as well. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, I think, Nasim, one of the things that is meaningful to me, and having worked with these folks, and that is when they would say, I didn't feel like I was in prison today because of what we did, because of who we chose to be today. Mm. It didn't feel like I was locked up. I felt free. Mm. And to accomplish something like that is only by the grace of the one who loves us more than we can ever love ourselves.
True. Well said indeed. And I can't think of anything better than that to finish on. Thank you
All right.
so much, Angela. I can hear Zelda barking in the background.
Yeah,
Time for
and
lunch.
Barry. There's 4 dogs here, so they're sounding off.
They're sounding off.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Angela. And I know we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much for being part of Edinburgh Interfaith Association's Spotlight.
I cherish what you're doing. Thank you.